All right, let's talk about this Alaska thing. You've seen the takes. Trump and Putin. Yalta 2.0. World being carved up again. Sounds dramatic. Also kinda lazy. This isn't 1945. Nobody's redrawing the entire map of Europe with a pencil and a cigar. This is one war, one front, and one big question. Can the shooting stop long enough to lock in rules that hold? Here's the deal. Yalta was Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, dividing the post-Nazi order. Borders moved. Whole countries switched columns. That's not what's on the table here. Alaska is about a ceasefire, or at least a freeze, with verification, with conditions, with penalties if anyone cheats. Less New World Order. More, can we stop the bleeding without rewarding it? So why now? Because leverage moved. Before Wheels Up, Putin said nice things about Trump. Not the usual tone. Why the sudden warmth? Pressure. Russia's economy isn't collapsing, but it's grinding. Growth stalled. Oil revenue softer. Budget gap wide. Inflation sticky. Rates high. War costs huge and often off the books. 18 rounds of sanctions don't make headlines anymore, but they do make life harder. And the big stick Washington keeps waving is something nastier: secondary sanctions. Not just we sanction Russia, but we sanction anyone who funds Russia. Buyers, shippers, insurers, banks. That includes India. That includes China. That includes the shadow fleet ferrying barrels around the world like it's a spy movie. If that hammer drops for real, Moscow's options shrink fast. That alone makes a meeting worth the flight. Let's talk format. First, it's the two of them, just interpreters. That means they want to test top lines without staff locking them in. After that, bring in the teams. That's where the grind starts. Agenda is predictable. Ceasefire mechanics, verification and monitoring, sequencing of any relief, snapback penalties, maybe a narrow path back to arms control if the guns actually go quiet, and a tiny bit of trade oxygen without blowing up the sanctions wall. Not friendship, not vibes. Price and enforcement. About those headlines yelling sanctions lifted. No. Allowing travel or issuing a waiver so people can sit in the same room is not appeasement. That's logistics. The real question is what gets traded for what, in what order, and with what tripwires. Do you get any relief only after compliance, or do you hand out goodies first and pray? Is there an automatic snapback, or do we argue every time someone fires a shell across a line? If the design is weak, the deal's weak, period. Let's hit the European angle, because it matters. Publicly, Europe is all unity slogans and blue and yellow flags. Privately, when you talk about enforcing secondary sanctions, tariffs, energy shocks, supply chains, and real costs, the room gets quiet. It's not hypocrisy, it's politics. Leaders protect their voters' jobs and power bills. If Alaska produces a paper that can't survive Europe's parliaments, enforcement will wobble and Moscow will find every seam. That's just how the world works. And there's some spicy backstory. One of Trump's advisors told a story from a G7 meeting. He asked, if we go after anyone buying Russian oil, and yes, that means China, are you ready for a 200% tariff? The table suddenly discovered its own wood grain. That's the gap between posture and price tag. Everyone's hawkish until the invoice shows up. Okay, what does each side actually want? Moscow wants a freeze that locks something in or at least stops the bleeding. Predictability on sanctions so the economy can plan. A path back to arms control talks so it doesn't look like a pariah forever. Washington wants quiet guns, credible verification, penalties that trigger automatically, and enough European buy-in to make it stick. Also, if it can pry at the Russia-China alignment even a little, that's gravy. Kyiv wants real security, not just a pretty statement. Time to rebuild. A freeze that doesn't become a forever front line. Europe wants unity without recession. Safety without a gas bill revolt. Not complicated, just messy. 3 scenarios. 1. A freeze with teeth, clear lines, monitors who can actually see. A ladder of penalties that fires automatically. Relief, if any, is tiny and phased and reversible. Arms control penciled in only if the freeze holds. Europe signs on cautiously. Markets relax a little. Kyiv isn't in love with it, but gets ammo, training, and time. 2. A paper peace. Big words, soft spine. Waivers creep. Lines get tested. 6 months later, we're back here with less credibility. 3. No deal. New pain. Talks break. The US hits secondary sanctions. Europe hesitates. Moscow leans on the shadow fleet. Oil pops. Everyone gets cranky. Cyber mischief goes up. Nobody wins. You get the idea. Which one's most likely? The incentives point to option 1, the freeze with teeth, because it's the only one everyone can live with. But teeth is doing the heavy lifting. You need real verification. You need conditional relief, not blanket relief. You need automatic snapbacks, so enforcement isn't a new political fight every week. If those parts wobble, it slides into option 2, the photo op version that ages badly. Let's talk verification for a second. It's not just observers in orange vests. It's sensors, imagery, patrol windows, reporting schedules, site access, and pre-agreed penalties. It's defining what counts as a violation, who makes that call, and how fast the penalty lands. If it's vague, it's useless. If it's clear, everyone can price the risk and behave. Secondary sanctions deserve a quick plain English pass. Think of them like a force field around Russia's economy. You don't just hit the target. You hit anyone who tries to pass money or goods through the field. That's why they bite. But it's also why they're messy. If you dial them up, you will hit partners and allies. That's not an accident. It's the point. The question is whether you can keep that coalition intact while the pain is being felt. That's the Alaska stress test. What should you listen for when the statements drop? Words like conditional, phased, verified, automatic, snapback, monitoring, compliance window, violation threshold. If you hear adjectives and poetry, be suspicious. If you hear numbers and timelines, that's better. If you see Europe committing to legal steps with dates, that's best. Also watch for code words about third parties, non-compliant purchasers, illicit shipping, maritime insurance. Financial intermediaries. That's the China and India section, just without the names. Let's clear a few myths. This is Yalta 2.0. No, it's not. Any waiver equals surrender. No, meetings need chairs. Europe will go all in, no matter what. Not if it melts their economy. Any deal rewards aggression. It depends on the structure. A deal with hard verification and instant penalties can deter better than war forever. A mushy deal encourages cheating. The design is the difference. Domestic politics? Oh, it'll be loud. If any relief appears anywhere, critics will call it soft. If secondary sanctions loom, supporters will call it tough. The truth is boring. It's about whether the architecture changes behavior. If it does, you'll see fewer explosions and steadier markets. If it doesn't, you'll get headlines and nothing else. What does this mean for your actual life? If enforcement tightens on Russian barrels, prices move. If tariffs expand as part of secondary sanctions, some goods get pricier. If risk drops because a real freeze takes hold, markets calm down and costs ease. Geopolitics shows up on your receipt before it shows up in your textbook. That's why the nuts and bolts matter more than the sound bites. Quick word on China, because it's the uninvited guest in this room. If a freeze stabilizes Russia, Beijing keeps a useful partner without carrying the whole load. If secondary sanctions escalate, Beijing has choices: double down and risk much bigger tariffs, or trim sails to protect exports. Washington doesn't need a divorce, it just needs a little distance. Moscow doesn't want to be totally dependent either. That tension is real, and it's inside every sentence of this process. If I had to design a workable package, I'd do this. Short initial ceasefire window, like 30 days, monitored densely. One tiny, clearly defined sanctions adjustment only after verified quiet. Publish the penalty ladder up front. This violation equals this penalty. Automatically, no debate. Build in humanitarian corridors, POW exchanges, and demining as separate tracks with their own checklists. Schedule a narrow arms control meeting, but only if the ceasefire survives the first window. Keep every step reversible. No giant gifts to build trust. Trust is what you get after the steps work, not before. What could blow it up? A spoiler attack that forces one side to respond. Domestic pressure that demands maximalist goals. European split on enforcement. Or a sloppy text that leaves holes you could drive a convoy through. You prevent that by being boring. Define everything. Write like a lawyer. Punish violations fast. Reward compliance slow. So where do I land? Alaska isn't a sequel to Yalta. It's a leverage test with real-world consequences. Putin wants stability without humiliation. Trump wants quiet on the front and leverage on the back end. Europe wants unity without a recession. Kyiv wants security that counts. There's a narrow middle where everyone gets just enough to claim progress and live to fight. Politically, not literally, another day. That middle is a freeze with teeth. Anything softer is theater. Anything harsher risks a wider economic shock that nobody really wants. One last thing. Don't get hypnotized by the handshake photo. The measure of success isn't the podium vibe. It's whether artillery fire actually drops. It's whether monitors can do their jobs. It's whether penalties hit without a week of arguing. It's whether markets stop flinching at every headline. If those needles move, the deal works. If they don't, it didn't, no matter how pretty the press release looked. All right, I'm done. Your turn. What would you trade for what? Would you pull the secondary sanctions trigger now, or hold it as leverage? What's the minimum Kiev has to get for a freeze to be worth it? Drop it in the comments. I'll read them. And remember, in geopolitics, the details are the policy. The words tell the story. The numbers decide the ending.